One freezing winter night, a homeless woman's soulful singing echoed in front of a billionaire's mansion. What he did next changed both their lives forever. Elliot Grayson was a man of contradictions. A billionaire known for his razor-sharp business acumen, he lived in a palatial estate perched on a hill, away from the city's noise. Behind his empire's glittering success lay a life of solitude. Years of relentless ambition had left Elliot with wealth beyond imagination, but no one to share it with. He had lost touch with his family long ago, his closest relationship being with his loyal butler, Mr. Bradley, who ran the house with military precision. Meanwhile, down in the heart of the bustling city, Clara Rivers spent her days searching for hope. Once a promising singer with dreams of making it big, life had dealt her a cruel hand. A series of misfortunes left her homeless, living in shelters and singing on street corners for spare change. Her only possession of value was a weathered guitar, a relic of happier times when her voice was her ticket to a brighter future. Despite her hardships, Clara carried herself with quiet resilience. She sang to survive and keep the remnants of her dreams alive. Little did she know, her voice would soon reach someone who could change everything. One particularly harsh winter night, Clara found herself outside a grand mansion. Snow fell steadily, painting the streets white, and the cold air bit at her fingertips as she strummed her guitar. She sang a song from her childhood, her voice raw and filled with emotion. It was a melody that spoke of loss, hope, and the fragile beauty of life. Inside the mansion, Elliot sat in his study, poring over financial reports. The faint sound of Clara's singing reached his ears through the heavy silence of his home. At first he dismissed it as a distant street performer, but as the haunting notes lingered, something stirred within him. He rose from his chair, drawn to the sound. Elliot moved to the window, pulling back the heavy curtains to reveal the source of the music. There, under the glow of a street lamp, stood Clara. Her breath puffed in the freezing air as she sang, her figure fragile yet defiant against the cold. For a moment, Elliot simply watched, mesmerized by the contrast between his warm, gilded world and her harsh reality. Then, something in her voice broke through his carefully constructed walls, compelling him to act. Clara's song ended and she lowered her guitar, her fingers trembling from the cold. She was used to being ignored, her music often blending into the background noise of the city. But tonight, something felt different. She glanced up and saw the silhouette of a man in the mansion's window. Their eyes didn't meet, but for a moment, she felt seen, a rarity in her life on the streets. Inside, Elliot hesitated. He wasn't a man of impulsive decisions, yet something about the woman's voice resonated with him. It wasn't just her music, it was the emotion behind it, a longing that mirrored his own unspoken regrets. Against his better judgment, he stepped away from the window, grabbed his coat, and ventured outside. The mansion's grand doors opened with a soft creak, and Clara looked up in surprise. Elliot stood on the steps, his imposing figure framed by the glow of the porch light. For a moment, neither spoke, the snow falling silently between them. Finally, Elliot broke the silence. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone cautious but not unkind. "Clara," she replied, clutching her guitar defensively. She had no idea what to expect, but her instincts told her this encounter was different. Elliot gestured toward the house. "Come inside, you'll freeze out here." Clara hesitated, her pride clashing with her desperation. She didn't know this man. Why would a stranger care about her? But the warmth emanating from the open door was tempting, and she couldn't ignore the sincerity in his voice. After a moment's pause, she nodded and followed him inside. The contrast was staggering. The mansion's interior was luxurious, with ornate chandeliers and polished marble floors. Clara felt out of place, her worn clothes and weathered guitar a stark juxtaposition to the opulence around her. She clutched her guitar tightly, as if it were the only piece of herself she could hold on to in this foreign world. Mr. Bradley, the butler, appeared almost immediately, his expression a mixture of surprise and disapproval. "Sir, is everything all right?" he asked, his voice clipped. "It's fine, Bradley," Elliot replied firmly. "Prepare some tea and a warm meal." Clara's eyes widened in disbelief. I don't want to trouble you," she stammered. "You're not," Elliot said, his voice softening. "Just sit. Warm up." Clara sat hesitantly by the crackling fireplace, her fingers thawing as the heat enveloped her. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of safety, but also uncertainty about what was to come. Elliot stepped into the icy night, his coat flapping in the cold wind. The quiet crunch of snow under his polished shoes felt almost foreign against the backdrop of his grand estate. Clara stood frozen, her eyes wide with surprise. She wasn't used to anyone paying attention to her, let alone someone who appeared as formidable as the man before her. "You must be freezing," Elliot said, his voice softer than he intended. "Come inside. Let me offer you some warmth." Clara hesitated. Years of hardship had taught her to be wary of kind gestures. They often came with strings attached, ones she couldn't afford. Yet something in Elliot's demeanor, a vulnerability masked by his tailored coat and stoic expression, made her take a cautious step forward. "I won't hurt you," Elliot assured her, noticing her hesitation. "You can leave whenever you want." Taking a deep breath, Clara nodded and followed him inside. The warmth of the mansion enveloped her immediately, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The opulence of the grand foyer was overwhelming. Marble floors gleamed under the light of a massive crystal chandelier, and the walls were adorned with expensive artwork that seemed to whisper tales of another world. "This way," Elliot gestured, leading her to a sitting room with a roaring fireplace. He called out for Mr. Bradley, who appeared with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime serving others. "Tea, please, and bring some blankets," Elliot instructed. As Mr. Bradley disappeared, Elliot turned to Clara. "What's your name?" "Clara," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Clara," he repeated as if testing how it felt on his tongue. "You have a beautiful voice. Do you sing professionally?" She shook her head, clutching her guitar protectively. "Not anymore. I used to dream of it, but life had other plans." Elliot nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. "Sometimes life has a way of taking us down paths we never imagined," he said, almost to himself. The conversation was interrupted by Mr. Bradley, who returned with a tray of tea and a pile of thick blankets. Clara accepted a steaming cup gratefully, the warmth seeping into her chilled hands. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax, even if just a little. Elliot observed her quietly. There was something about Clara that intrigued him, a resilience that seemed to defy the odds stacked against her. Her voice had stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the melody, it was the raw emotion, the unspoken pain and hope intertwined in every note. "Why do you sing?" he asked suddenly. Clara looked up, surprised by the question. "To survive," she said after a moment, "and to remember who I used to be." Her honesty caught him off guard. Elliot wasn't used to people being so open with him. His world was one of polished facades and calculated interactions. Clara's authenticity was like a breath of fresh air, albeit one tinged with sadness. "If you're willing, I could help you," Elliot said, the words escaping before he had time to reconsider. "You shouldn't have to sing on the streets." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why would you want to help me? You don't even know me." Elliot hesitated. He wasn't sure of the answer himself. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was the realization that he too had been lost in his own way. "Maybe because I see something in you," he admitted finally, "something worth saving." The days that followed were a blur of cautious steps toward an unlikely friendship. Clara had reluctantly accepted Elliot's offer to stay in the guest wing of his mansion, though she insisted it was only temporary. Her pride wouldn't allow her to rely on anyone for long, especially not someone as seemingly untouchable as Elliot. Elliot, on the other hand, found himself drawn to Clara in ways he couldn't quite explain. She was a stark contrast to the world he had built for himself. Raw, unpolished, and unapologetically real. Her presence disrupted the careful order of his life, yet he found it oddly comforting. One evening, as Clara strummed her guitar in the quiet of the sitting room, Elliot approached her with a proposition. "Why don't you perform again?" he suggested, sitting down across from her. Clara looked up startled. "What do you mean?" "I mean on a real stage with an audience. You have a gift, Clara. It deserves to be shared." She shook her head vehemently. "That life is behind me. I tried and I failed. People don't want to hear me sing." "I think you're wrong," Elliot said firmly, "and I'm willing to bet there are plenty of people who would feel the same way." Clara's fingers stilled on the strings of her guitar. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Elliot leaned back, his gaze steady. "Because I know what it's like to lose yourself, to let the world convince you that you're not enough. But you are, Clara. You just need to believe it." His words struck a chord, one she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Clara looked down at her guitar, the familiar weight of it grounding her. Could she take such a risk again? The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot smiled a rare, genuine smile that softened his otherwise stern features. "That's all I ask." That night, as Clara lay in the unfamiliar comfort of the guest room, she couldn't shake Elliot's words from her mind. For the first time in years, the possibility of reclaiming her dreams didn't feel so far-fetched. The days turned into weeks, and Clara found herself slowly adjusting to life within Elliot's sprawling estate. Though the luxurious surroundings often felt surreal, it was the quiet moments that began to matter most. Elliot's genuine interest in her music and her past was unlike anything she had encountered before. It was both unsettling and strangely comforting. "I've arranged for a small performance," Elliot announced one morning over breakfast. Clara nearly choked on her coffee, staring at him in disbelief. "You did what?" she demanded, her voice rising an octave. "Nothing big," Elliot said quickly, trying to placate her. "Just a gathering of a few friends and colleagues, a private audience. I thought it might be less intimidating than jumping straight to a public stage." Clara's hands trembled as she set her cup down. "You had no right to do that," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not ready." "You'll never feel ready," Elliot countered, his tone firm but not unkind. "Sometimes you just have to leap." She glared at him, the vulnerability she had kept hidden threatening to spill over. "Do you have any idea how terrifying this is for me?" Elliot sighed, leaning forward. "I do, and that's why I'll be there every step of the way. But Clara, you have something special. Don't let fear steal that from you." Her anger simmered, but beneath it, a small flicker of hope began to grow. She hated that he might be right. Reluctantly, she agreed. The evening of the performance arrived sooner than Clara anticipated. She stood backstage in a modest but elegant dress Elliot had insisted on purchasing for her. Her guitar felt heavier than usual, the weight of her anxiety pressing down on her. Elliot appeared at her side, his presence steadying. "You've got this," he said quietly. "Just be yourself." Clara nodded, though her stomach churned with nerves. The sound of murmured conversations reached her ears as the small audience settled in the room beyond. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the makeshift stage. The soft lighting bathed her in a warm glow, and for a moment, she was blinded by the brightness. She strummed the first chord, her fingers trembling. But as she began to sing, the fear started to melt away. Her voice filled the room, weaving a tapestry of emotion that left the audience spellbound. The raw vulnerability in her performance was both haunting and captivating. Elliot watched from the sidelines, his chest tightening with pride. He hadn't been sure how Clara would react under pressure, but she had surpassed every expectation. The room erupted into applause as she finished, and for the first time in years, Clara felt a spark of confidence. As the guests mingled after the performance, several approached Clara to commend her talent. One woman, a prominent music producer, handed Clara her card. "You have a gift," she said. "I'd love to discuss working together." Clara was overwhelmed, but Elliot's reassuring hand on her shoulder grounded her. "You did it," he said softly. She turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted. Elliot smiled, the weight of his loneliness lifting slightly. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had truly made a difference. The night of the charity gala arrived with an air of opulence and grandeur. Clara stood behind the velvet curtains, listening to the hum of polished conversations and the tinkling of crystal glasses in the ballroom. It was a world so far removed from her own that she felt like an imposter stepping into a dream she didn't belong in. The weight of expectation pressed heavily on her chest. This wasn't just about performing. It was about making a statement. Her music had always been her refuge, an unfiltered reflection of her soul. But tonight she felt the pull of compromise, to alter herself to fit the glittering veneer of this elite audience. As the MC announced her name, Clara took a steadying breath and stepped onto the stage. The light blinded her momentarily, and for a brief moment the room's silence felt deafening. She began to play, her fingers moving instinctively across the strings of her guitar. Her voice followed, but there was a hesitation in it, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. The audience responded with polite applause, but Clara could feel the difference. Her performance was technically flawless, but it lacked the raw, unguarded emotion that had always been her signature. As she left the stage, a knot of unease settled in her stomach. She felt as though she had betrayed herself to meet the expectations of others. Elliot was waiting for her backstage, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer immediate praise, nor did he criticize. Instead, he simply placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. As the night wore on, Clara mingled with the guests, receiving compliments that felt hollow. She knew she had given them what they wanted, but not what she needed to give. When the evening ended, she retreated to her room, unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted within her. In the days that followed, Clara found herself caught in a whirlwind of activity. The charity gala had opened new doors, with offers pouring in for high-profile performances and recording deals. But the more she tried to navigate this new world, the more she felt the weight of its demands. Meetings with managers and producers turned into negotiations over her image and sound, each conversation chipping away at the authenticity she had fought so hard to preserve. One afternoon, Clara sat in the studio of a renowned producer who spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to shaping stars. He suggested changes to her songs, tweaks to her appearance, and even a complete rebranding that would make her more relatable to a mainstream audience. Clara listened in silence, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. When the meeting ended, she walked out into the crisp winter air, feeling a suffocating sense of loss. The streets, once her stage, now seemed like a distant memory. She found herself wandering until she reached the small park where she had often performed. Sitting on a familiar bench, Clara took out her guitar and began to play. The music flowed freely, unburdened by expectations or judgments. For the first time in weeks, she felt like herself again. Elliot found her there hours later, her fingers still moving across the strings. He didn't interrupt, simply sitting beside her and listening. When she finally stopped, he spoke softly. "You don't have to choose between success and authenticity. You can have both, but only if you stay true to who you are." Clara looked at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "What if I'm not enough?" she whispered. Elliot shook his head. "You are. You always have been." With Elliot's encouragement, Clara made a decision that would redefine her path. She canceled her upcoming meetings with the producers who sought to mold her into someone she wasn't, and instead focused on organizing a performance that was entirely her own. It would be held in the heart of the city, open to anyone who wanted to listen. No tickets, no exclusivity, just music. Word spread quickly, and the night of the performance drew a crowd that filled the small venue to capacity. People from all walks of life gathered, drawn by the promise of something genuine. Clara stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding, but this time, it wasn't fear that fueled her. It was determination. She began to sing, her voice carrying the weight of her journey. Each note was a testament to her struggles and triumphs, a raw and unfiltered expression of who she truly was. The audience was captivated, their faces reflecting the emotions her music evoked. Clara felt a connection that transcended the barriers of status and circumstance. As the final note faded, the room erupted into applause. But it wasn't the applause that mattered to Clara. It was the faces of the people who had truly heard her, who had seen her for who she was. Among them was Elliot, his eyes filled with pride and a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had helped her find her voice, but it was Clara who had chosen to use it. In that moment, Clara realized that success wasn't about fitting into someone else's world. It was about creating her own, one where she could stand unafraid and unapologetically herself. The days following Clara's city performance brought a sense of clarity she had long sought but never found. The outpouring of support and connection with the audience affirmed her belief that she didn't need to conform to succeed. Each message, each face in the crowd was a reminder that her story and her music resonated deeply. It wasn't about perfection, it was about honesty. Clara began to rebuild her career on her terms. Invitations came in, but this time she scrutinized them carefully, accepting only those that aligned with her values. She refused to let anyone dictate the course of her art. The world had tried to tell her who to be, but she had learned the most important lesson of all. The strength of her voice lay in its truth. Elliot, who had quietly stood by her side throughout her journey, found his own life transformed in the process. Watching Clara rediscover herself had awakened something within him. The walls of his carefully constructed world began to crack, and through those cracks came light. He realized that helping Clara had also been a way of helping himself, to reconnect with the humanity he had buried beneath his success. One crisp afternoon, Elliot invited Clara to the estate's garden. The autumn leaves swirled around them as they walked in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Finally, Elliot spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Clara, I've spent so much of my life building a world that feels safe but isn't real. You've reminded me what it means to take risks, to face the uncertainty of being vulnerable." Clara stopped, turning to face him. She saw the openness in his expression, a far cry from the guarded man she had first met. "You've done the same for me," she replied. "I couldn't have found my way without you." In that moment, the bond they had forged became something unspoken, yet deeply understood. They were two people who had helped each other heal, not through grand gestures but through quiet, steadfast support. Clara's music continued to grow, but her focus remained on authenticity rather than fame. She partnered with grassroots organizations to bring music to underserved communities, performing in schools, shelters, and public spaces. Her journey from the streets to the stage became a beacon of hope for others who felt overlooked by the world. At one of these events, a young girl approached Clara, clutching a notebook filled with lyrics. "Your songs make me feel like I'm not invisible," the girl said, her voice trembling with emotion. Clara knelt down, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "You're not invisible," she said gently. "Your voice matters, and the world needs to hear it." Moments like these became Clara's true measure of success. The glitz and glamour of high-profile events paled in comparison to the raw connection she felt with the people she performed for. Her music was no longer about survival. It was about creating a space where others could find solace and strength. Meanwhile, Elliot found a new purpose in philanthropy. Inspired by Clara's impact, he used his resources to support initiatives that empowered artists and musicians from marginalized backgrounds. The once cold and calculated businessman had discovered a deeper meaning to his success, one that transcended profits and prestige. Their paths, though intertwined, began to diverge as they each pursued their newfound passions. Yet, there was no sadness in their parting. Their connection had never been about dependency, but about growth, and they parted with a mutual understanding that their journeys would always be linked in spirit. Years later, Clara stood on the stage of a packed auditorium, her guitar in hand and her heart full. The room buzzed with anticipation as she prepared to perform a song she had written about her journey. The lyrics spoke of resilience, of finding light in the darkest places, and of the people who had guided her along the way. As her voice filled the space, she spotted a familiar figure in the crowd. Elliot sat in the back row, a quiet smile on his face. Though they hadn't seen each other in years, his presence was a reminder of how far they had both come. It was fitting that he was there, witnessing this moment of triumph. After the performance, Clara made her way through the crowd to find him. They embraced like old friends, their bond untouched by time. "You've come a long way," Elliot said, his voice filled with pride. "So have you," Clara replied. "Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Elliot chuckled softly. "You always had it in you. I just helped you see it." Their conversation was brief, but it carried the weight of everything they had shared. As they parted ways once again, there was no sadness, only gratitude for the roles they had played in each other's lives. Clara's story became a testament to the power of resilience and authenticity. Her music reached people from all walks of life, and her commitment to staying true to herself inspired countless others to do the same. She had built a career that was not only successful, but meaningful, rooted in the connections she had forged along the way. Elliot, too, found his sense of fulfillment. His philanthropic work brought him into contact with people and stories that reminded him of the value of compassion and community. The once isolated businessman had become a bridge for others, using his influence to uplift those who needed it most. Though their lives took different directions, Clara and Elliot remained a part of each other's stories. They exchanged letters and occasionally crossed paths at events, their friendship a quiet but enduring presence in their lives. As Clara strummed the final chord of a song during a performance years later, she looked out into the audience and saw a sea of faces illuminated by her music. In that moment, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had found her voice, her purpose, and her place in the world, not by conforming, but by daring to be herself. The applause swelled, but it wasn't the noise that moved her. It was the knowledge that she had turned her struggles into something beautiful, something that mattered. And in the quiet moments that followed, as she bowed her head in gratitude, she knew that her journey and the connections she had made along the way would continue to echo far beyond the final note.